Hey everyone, and welcome to this Science and Education webinar, which is an initiative from Lusófona University to share scientific knowledge that we are creating in our research centers, not only with our students here at the university, but with a wider community in general. My name is Sofia Caldeira. I'm a professor and a researcher at Ciência, Lusófona Center for Research and Applied Communication and New Technologies. And I'm going to be sharing today with you some of the work that I've been conducting and developing within this center. And it's work that has been partially developed in the context of Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship, which has been funded by the European Commission. And it's on the topic, as the title says, of feminisms and social media. And at the end of the question, we will have time, at the end of the session, we will have time for a very brief Q&A. So let's start with a little bit of context. I think we all know by now how ever-present digital and social media has become in our contemporary society. And it has become a part of pretty much nearly all aspects of our everyday life. It's through social media that we keep in touch with our friends and family. It's where we go to get updated on the news. It's also where we go to be entertained. But it also became a really important tool for contemporary politics, and of course, by extension, also for feminist practices. Now, this isn't something that is new. The internet and digital technologies have been used for activist and feminist purposes pretty much since they were invented. However, in the last couple of decades, we've been seeing a very deliberate adoption of digital tools for social justice practice. And this has led to what some scholars and some activists have termed as a shift to a new age of feminism, a fourth wave of feminism. Now, social media platforms like Instagram have become more and more an essential part for contemporary feminisms. And we have seen this in those big moments of protest and those big moments of social mobilization, like we saw with the Me Too movement, like we saw with the Black Lives Matter, like we saw here in Portugal with the Vermelho em Belém, which I will talk a little bit more about later. But this isn't what is the dominant way of using social media. In fact, most of the times when we are using social media, it's in very mundane and everyday contexts. And as such, it's also in these mundane contexts that we are encountering political and feminist content. And it's in our everyday life that we can enact small acts of feminism. And this isn't done just by those traditional political actors like politicians, like activists, but it's also being done by so-called ordinary people, people like us that don't have a sustained involvement with these political issues. So my research is starting from this idea of everyday politics and everyday feminisms. And what I've tried to do in my work is to look at how people are encountering and engaging with feminist content in their everyday lives, and how this political content is coexisting and appearing alongside all the personal interests that we have on social media, alongside kitten photos, alongside pictures of our friends. Now, when we talk about feminisms on social media, we know that these kind of practices can take place in all kinds of online settings, in all kinds of social media platforms, from Twitter to TikTok and everything in between. But it's really important that when we are researching this kind of practices, that we are paying attention to how different platforms with their very different cultures of use and very different with their very different cultures of use can help to shape and to facilitate particular modes of feminist expression. So my research ended up focusing specifically on Instagram, and I've chose Instagram for several reasons. On the first level, because of course it's one of the most popular platforms, both here in Portugal, which is the focus of my research, but also internationally. But I also chose Instagram because it really tends to be imagined as a platform that is mostly concerned with aesthetics, with entertainment, or even as a commercial platform. But in fact, it's a place where a lot of political action is happening. And even though Instagram is being widely used for feminist and political purposes, still a lot of the dominant research that we see on this field tends to concern itself with more explicitly political platforms like Twitter. Okay, so in the last couple of years, my research has been exploring how Instagram is being used for everyday feminist practices, but also how these feminist cultures can draw from, but also resist to, existing attention economies and logics of popularity that are really central to platforms like Instagram. How these feminist practices are enmeshed with Instagrammable aesthetics, and also how these practices and conventions can end up shaping certain dominant feminist imaginaries that we all share. Today, I'm going to be giving you a really brief overview of a couple of different aspects of feminist cultures on Instagram, and to reflect a little bit on the possibilities, but also on the challenges that these practices can entail. I'm going to be sharing insights from different case studies, but also from my current postdoctoral project. And throughout this presentation, you can find little QR codes with relevant websites and relevant publications in case you are interested in reading about it in more depth. So let's get started with our examples. One of the most common ways to study feminisms online is through case studies. Now, case studies are, very briefly, well-defined and self-contained cases or actors that we use to explore digital and political dynamics more in depth. One of the case studies that I've conducted in my research was of the account of Tânia Graça, who is, for those who don't know, a very popular Portuguese feminist sexologist. Now, studying Tânia Graça's account allowed me to explore the relationship between feminist and self-promotional practices on Instagram, and to use this idea of the activist influencers as someone who takes advantage of the logics of Instagram to gain hundreds of thousands of followers, but who try to use these visibility that you gain online to promote social justice issues. For example, in order to gain visibility on Instagram, Tânia Graça's account has adopted a really consistent and aesthetically pleasing self-branding. She also develops strategies to interact with her followers in a way that, on one hand, is conducive to feminist community building, but that also helps to draw more engagement for her account through the use of, for example, Q&As or moments of dating advice where people have to get in touch with her account. She also promotes a kind of feminism that, for the most part, tends to be less confrontation and a bit more commercially friendly, a kind of happy feminism that allowed her to get, later on, commercial partnerships that helped her monetize her social media practice, and eventually to also expand her visibility beyond Instagram as she started to be invited, for example, for television shows, for radio shows, or to have opinion pieces in mainstream journals. Now, when we are doing case studies, we can also look at specific hashtag movements, as we had a lot of research happening with, for example, Me Too. Another of the cases that I've conducted in my work was on the Vermelho em Belém movement, And Vermelho em Belém, which translates roughly as Red in Belém, which is the house of the president here in Portugal. Vermelho em Belém was one of the first nationally created feminist hashtag movements that really took a wide adoption both in Portugal and internationally. This hashtag was created in response to a case of sexism in politics in Portugal, which happened during the 2021 presidential election, when a far-right politician insulted the appearance, and specifically the use of red lipstick, of another presidential candidate, in this case a woman who belonged to a left-wing party. Now, throughout this case study, I was able to explore the relationship between feminist action, gender discourses, and far-right populist politics. I was also able to look at practices of feminist solidarity online and to explore how these hashtags can very quickly start to generate a lot of tensions because they move from this solidarity movement to an emergence of sexist backlash, or even are very quickly appropriated for either contradictory discourses or for commercial interests. Now, while case studies do focus on very concrete examples, they can be really helpful for us to think and theorize about wider dynamics that happen within these platforms. For example, going back to the case of Tânia Graça, it helped to highlight how achieving visibility for a political message on Instagram is always dependent on following really certain platformized logics that ground visibility on things like platform metrics and often really opaque practices of algorithmic sorting. To ensure visibility on Instagram, users are required to perform certain forms of digital labor, either in terms of the content that they are creating or the ways that they are promoting it, the ways that they are engaging with other people, etc. And if through a somewhat optimistic social movement studies lens, we can look at this strategic appropriation of platform logics as a form of algorithmic activism, on the other hand, if we take a bit more of a cynical lens, we can also see it as a way in which the logics of the dominant influencer culture and its strategies to gamify visibility are becoming an unavoidable part of feminisms online, in what a scholar called Sophie Bishop called influencer creep. Now, with the case of Vermelho em Belém, on the other hand, it allowed me to make observations on the more visual and aesthetic side of feminisms on Instagram. Seeing how this hashtag movement was drawing on the very dominant platform vernaculars of Instagram, its visual conventions, so to say, it was drawing on this idea of Instagram as a photographic platform and specifically a platform for selfie cultures. It appropriated this selfie culture for feminist aims in what can be termed as a practice of selfie activism, where the selfies are emerging not only as a response to the insults of that far-right candidate and to the use of red lipstick, but it led people to start sharing these photographs of themselves, no matter their gender, wearing red lipstick in a show of solidarity with the insulted candidate, but also as a broader message, a way to call attention to the sexist expectations that we can have for female politicians, but not for male politicians. Moving on from case studies, we can also explore feminisms on social media in larger scales. And we can do this in various ways, but the one that I'm going to be talking about today is the adoption and the adaptation of digital methods for feminist media research. Now, very briefly, just to contextualize, when we talk about digital methods, we are talking about this academic strategy to use digitally native objects, things like platform metrics, like algorithms, like links, like tags, retweets, hashtags, etc., and use these objects as simultaneously the focus of our research, but also as the tool for researching something. I'm going to give you an example of this approach through an exploratory study that I've conducted also in 2021, where I was analyzing and trying to get a sense of the landscape of feminist hashtags in Portugal. This study started from a set of very carefully selected feminist hashtags that were used in the national context. These hashtags try to reflect different feminist approaches. So, for example, I included two more generic hashtags, so to say, terms that are broadly used within Instagram, in this case, Feminismo Portugal and Igualdade de Género, so Feminism Portugal and gender equality. I also included one hashtag that was connected to a specific movement that was the Não Partilhes movement, so the Don't Share It, which was a movement happening at the time to criminalize the non-consensual sharing of intimate images. And finally, I've also included the hashtag Portugal Mais Igual, so a more equal Portugal, which was a hashtag that was connected to an institutional campaign from the Portuguese government. And this was really important because prior research on feminisms in Portugal shows that the state-led influence tends to be quite big in Portugal. So after selecting these four hashtags, I searched them for over a month, and I collected posts of users who agreed to participate in the study. I ended up with a data set of over 100 users and nearly 300 posts for analysis, which I looked at both in a qualitative way, but also using digital tools like a software to create a network of co-hashtags that I will show you in a second, and also software to visualize aesthetic patterns. Now, in terms of what insights we can gain from these kinds of approaches, within the nearly 300 posts that I studied, I've encountered over 1,300 unique hashtags. So hashtags that were used in conjunction with those four originally selected ones. Using a tool called Gephi, I was able to see the links between how these different hashtags were being shared across different posts, and this helped me to get a sense of different dynamics of hashtag activism that are often a bit invisible when we are looking at a single hashtag. For example, while hashtags connected to specific movements, like the case of Não Partilhes, were creating very thematically homogeneous clusters, and this is the Não Partilhes cluster. If we look at that, we can see that it only is used alongside hashtags that relate to its same topic, in this case the idea of non-consensual sharing of intimate images. On the other hand, the most generic hashtags that are based on those far-reaching terms like feminism or gender equality mix together with a lot of different issues. These include hashtags on feminism, but also on pregnancy, on mental health, on body positivity, on sex positivity, but also on things like fashion and many, many other issues. We can interpret these findings in at least two very different ways. So, on a more optimistic light, we can see all of this diversity as a sign of an intersectional consciousness. We can see it as a sign that the people that are sharing recognize that people are affected by many different issues, and that all these issues need to be a part of feminist action. On the other hand, we can see that this diversity also reveals very contradictory at times visions of feminisms. And for example, it can reveal how feminist discourses can coexist with more post-feminist perspectives that really try to simplify and tame feminism and to center it around concerns like beauty or appearances. And this can dilute and diminish the political impact of these online actions. At the same time, we also need to recognize that this pluralization can also shape and sometimes even limit the kind of political potential that practices of hashtag activism can have. Because if we are lacking either a unifying concern or a central key actor, these hashtags seem to have a more limited potential to actually organize collective action and strategically mobilize campaigns. So, unlike the dominant imaginaries that we have of hashtag activism, that often center really concrete, specific, but also highly visible movements like we had with Me Too, we need to recognize that most of the social media feminist cultures tend to exist beyond these very limited spaces of deliberate coordination. And as such, hashtag activism in these broader contexts might not hold the same kind of political potential. Something else that was really interesting when I was looking at the content itself that was being shared within these hashtags on a more day-to-day basis, rather than within specific accounts or specific movements, was that most of the posts that I encountered did not really fit with that association between Instagram and photography or even selfies. Rather, most of the posts were what we call graphic compositions. So compositions that have, for example, a colorful background, some overlaid text, maybe some illustrations, and that are used as a way to convey information in a really simple and visually appealing format that plays with the perceptions of what is expected to do well on Instagram and what is expected to capture attention. These graphic compositions seem to take advantage of the Instagrammable aesthetics that were already popular at the moment. And we can see this, for example, in the use of colors that were very popular in 2021, like the pastel pink aesthetic. Using color, design, and other little graphic elements is an aid to capturing audience's attention, while it is within the text of these posts, both in the compositions themselves, but also in the very long captions that they often used. It's in this text that we are able to share feminist information and feminist reflections. So in a way, these compositions seem to follow a logic of templability. They are seemingly created with a more or less conscious awareness that other similar posts exist in the universe of Instagram, and they repeat over and over again very common aesthetic conventions. And sometimes it is even solidified in very easy to use templates in platforms like Canva. And this can, on one hand, give tools, aesthetic tools for the people creating feminist posts, but it also creates a really recognizable aesthetic and expectations of how these feminist engagements should look like when they are taking place on Instagram. Now, as I said before, in the last couple of years, with the Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship, I've started to look specifically at the format of Instagram stories, which my research showed that was being increasingly used as a political format, yet was still very underexplored in academic research. Stories as a format has different features that seemed really interesting and compelling to study. On one hand, it's a short format. It lasts anything between 5 seconds to 1 minute. It's also a multimodal format. That is, it's a format that allows for the combination of different aspects like photographs, videos, text, emojis, GIFs, audios, interactive stickers, all in a single story. But one of its most distinctive features in comparison to the rest of Instagram's content is that by default, it allows to share ephemeral content that is set to disappear after 24 hours. This idea of ephemerality was something that came up in interviews that I've done in previous research. In these conversations, some people said that they prefer to share more serious or political content in their stories because it was something that they felt had less pressure associated with its format. And this ease of sharing can be really important since sharing feminist content can be associated with risks of receiving online backlash, online hate, and this backlash can in turn discourage people from political participation. But in order to make sense of the complexity of stories as a political format, I needed to be able to look at the different aspects it encompassed and also the different relationships that we can establish with this media format. And this called for a methodological triangulation. It called for the combination of different approaches to be able to look at different aspects of the same object of study. In the case of this postdoctoral project, I decided to look firstly at the stories themselves, and I did this through a textual analysis. And here the term text should be taken as a very broad term because it includes not only the written words, but also the images, the videos, the sounds, etc. And for this part of the research, I counted with the help of 52 participants, and I ended up collecting nearly 3,000 stories over the course of 3 months. But I was also really interested in studying the people that were creating these stories, but also the people who were viewing and engaging with this content, which on social media, as we all know, can be two very diffuse and overlapping categories. So I ended up deciding to do interviews with feminist content producers, and I talked with 18 people who were different kinds of feminist creators and had different understandings of feminist discourse. And I talked with them about their social media practices, their conventions, their perceptions about Instagram and the format of stories. But I also conducted focus groups with Instagram audiences. And I've also conducted focus groups with feminist Instagram audiences, and I've done 8 focus groups with a total of 46 participants. And we had really engaging conversations about how people are using stories in their own everyday life, how they are engaging with feminist content in this context, etc. So sharing some very quick insights of these overarching studies, I really wanted to highlight the complexities of stories as a political format, but also the ambivalences that people feel when using them. First of all, from that analysis of the nearly 3,000 stories, it showed that stories do bring more ease in sharing political content, but this wasn't happening necessarily necessarily with the content that they were originally producing themselves. Rather, political conversations were happening through resharing, and this emerged as an extremely common political practice. We can see resharing as a small act of political engagement and as something that allows for a kind of political expression by proxy, something that seemed to help to mitigate those fears of backlash that I mentioned earlier. But resharing was also a way to amplify the distribution of political content, because through resharing, you can accidentally encounter feminist and political content through the stories of, for example, your friends, without necessarily having to follow any overtly activist accounts. And this can also be really important because previous studies show that political content tends to be better received when it's coming from people that we already know and with whom we have an established social relationship. But of course, this study also revealed that stories can have certain limitations as a political format, especially when we are looking at resharing, which tends to be a very partial or fragmented content. For example, when people are resharing a longer carousel, they often choose just to share one of the slides or a couple of the slides. Or when we are resharing a longer video or reel, it gets automatically cut by Instagram to a 15-second snippet. And this can create a certain sense of context loss, which of course does have implications for the feminist and political potential of these formats. Because if stories are only offering partial information, then the labor of getting to the complete information is pushed onto the viewer rather than being placed on the person that is doing the sharing itself. It is the viewer who needs to actively click through and go to the original post, click through the links, and read the full text, etc. So, in a way, while feminist education and action is something that can be teased by and amplified through stories, it's something that tends to be happening elsewhere. Now, with the second approach, with the interviews, they help to illustrate the tensions and the ambivalences that are underlying feminist practices on social media. Stories seem to make easier for people to use them and to carry less pressure, as we mentioned before. They made it easier for people to be more politically vocal in the context of their own everyday lives. They were also seen as this format that had a potentially larger reach than you could have with a post. And this was really useful for the aim of spreading a political message to the wider number of people possible. But at the same time, people were very aware of the potential risks of visibility on social media. And they shared about all those anxieties that can come with sharing political content, those fears of getting it wrong when we are sharing something, and also this ever-present threat of backlash, even when they didn't experience it personally themselves. And in this context, stories were also felt, and maybe a bit paradoxically, as a safer format, because stories do tend to circulate mostly amongst the people that you already know, that you already follow, and that sometimes are more like-minded in their political concerns and views. And this is something that some people actually try to cultivate by using tools like the close friends option. So, these interviews also showed that there are these feelings of constant pressure to be online. And on one hand, these pressures can come from feelings of political responsibility, from this idea that you should always be on top of every single emerging social issue or social controversy, and that you need to be reading about it, but also sharing about it and informing other people. But these kinds of pressures can also be coming from the dominant logics of Instagram itself. Because a lot of the participants felt that the algorithm logic of Instagram was pushing them to constantly sharing content in order to avoid being penalized and suppressed by the platform. And interestingly, in this context, stories emerged as a way to negotiate these pressures. They allowed people to be active on Instagram on a more regular basis, but to do it in less labor-intensive ways. For example, through those small acts of engagement like resharing that I mentioned before. And finally, the third approach highlighted the very particular temporalities of stories as a format. Because stories are set to disappear after 24 hours, they are really useful for engaging with timely and topical issues. For example, they were often used to share time and context specific information, like practical information about an ongoing event, but they were also a way to quickly react to the hot topics of the day. But of course, this quick temporality can also create feelings of political FOMO, so these fears of missing out, which are, as I mentioned, mixed with those feelings of political responsibility, and that create pressure to be engaging with these issues. At the same time, this temporality can also be a limitation in itself, because issues tend to be very quickly replaced by something else, so they end up leaving the collective consciousness very quickly. Now, these conversations with Instagram audiences also help to show how stories can place feminist concerns deeply within the fabric of everyday life. People tend to reach for Instagram, and particularly to stories, almost as if by impulse. They grab the phone in efforts to kill time and to fill empty moments of everyday life. And as such, the feminist content that is being encountered in this format is being sprinkled throughout the day. People are watching political content while they are waiting for the bus, while they are brushing their teeth, while they are waiting for the water to boil, etc. There is this almost constant viewing of political content, but at times it's not necessarily something that is very conscious. People talked about viewing stories very quickly, but often somewhat inattentively. And as such, we need to question how much of this information is actually being absorbed. Now, I don't mean to say with this that all stories consumption is by default inattentive, because people do often make very conscious efforts to be attentive to stories, especially the ones that they feel are politically relevant. But people need to make those actions. They need to be pausing the screens for reading the text. They need to be screenshotting the stories for reading it later. They need, again, to click on the links to go read the full article. So it's a labor-intensive purpose. So, to wrap up this very brief overview, I really hope that this webinar has shown you some of the possibilities, but also some of the limitations of engaging with political and feminist practices on social media, and showed you how this is shaped not only by the technical aspects of the platforms like Instagram, but also by its current cultures of use. I hope that this webinar gave you a sense that these digital feminist practices are not monolithic, but that they are plural and they are ever-changing, and they are something that we need to engage with seriously. So I really want to conclude by thanking everyone that watched this webinar, both here and online, and also thanking Lusófona for hosting this webinar, and thanking all the colleagues that collaborated in this research, and also the participants who gave their time and their really thoughtful insights, and without whom this work would never exist. So thank you all.